In 1887, deep in the red dust hills near Socorro, New Mexico, the stone chapel of Santa Perdida stood half swallowed by sand, its bell tower hollowed by lightning, and its iron gate locked from the inside with a bent, rusting rod. Inside, parishioners found a blood-stained birthing chair tucked behind the altar and 7 linen swaddles folded in the sacristy, each marked with the date of a silent delivery between 1882 and 1887. The Order of the Sisters of Perpetual Intercession, once revered for tending the dying during the Great Hunger of 1863, now housed only 4 surviving nuns, each mute, cloaked, and refusing to testify. Their days were spent steeped in incense and ink, copying missals long out of print, while travelers reported infant cries from beneath the floorboards. In territorial archives, Governor Edmund Prince received 5 sealed affidavits about a midwife dismissed for pagan customs and unauthorized record-keeping. One entry, dated August 2, 1886, recorded the disappearance of a newborn girl within 12 hours of her birth. Who sanctioned the deliveries no church recognized, and why were no children ever seen? The Sisters of Perpetual Intercession were admired for their solitude, Latin devotion, and herbal knowledge, their habit always perfumed faintly with lavender oil and candle smoke. But a 1889 court ledger lists 7 deliveries and 0 baptisms, each noted in the same hurried script, each followed by an unexplained transfer as the monastery quietly closed its gates. Vosedis now continue with Chapter 1, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script the beginning of the escalation, where you will report the first concrete signs that something is wrong. Introduce witnesses, neighbors, or official records that mention unusual changes. Describe scenes with sensory depth, e.g., creaking doors, dust in the air, etc. Reinforce the atmosphere of strangeness and apprehension. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words such as unbelievable, attention, etc. Allowed examples. Unbelievable, attention. OK. Do not use forbidden characters, Bauhaus lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 1, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. Felix Roterista Inglés Longa Horror dice, it was the dry season when Father Isidro Moran first arrived in Socorro in the spring of 1887, sent by the diocesan seat in Santa Fe to assess the long-neglected Santa Perdida Monastery. The chapel, constructed in 1819 and rebuilt twice after fires, was now visibly deteriorating, walls flaking, floorboards warped by desert moisture, and a faint acrid smell, like singed cotton, hanging in the sacristy. The monastery's small orchard, once tended by novices and known for its bitter pomegranates, was strangled by dustweed. Father Moran, trained in canon law and tasked with inventorying shuttered missions, carried a leather ledger and a folded letter from Bishop Jean-Baptiste Salpointe, authorizing a full inspection. What he found upon crossing the threshold defied the gentle decrepitude he expected. The door creaked open with a whimpering scrape. Inside, light filtered dimly through warped panes, and the scent of stale myrrh clung to the air. A bronze censer still swung slightly from a cord in the chancel. It was then that Father Moran noticed a faint trail of reddish residue, something like rust or dried clay, curving from the altar toward the vestry door. He paused, lips pressed, before stepping carefully around it. He was not alone. A figure emerged silently from the adjoining cloister. Sister Esperanza, the eldest of the remaining nuns, wrapped tightly in the faded black wool of her order. Her gaze remained downcast, hands concealed in her sleeves, yet she motioned gently for him to follow. He was shown to the refectory, where 3 other women sat in total silence, faces gaunt and eyes glassy, as if pulled from weeks of fever. No meal had been served. The long table held only a cracked jug of water and a damp ledger bearing names and dates written in the same angular hand, all in Latin. None of the women spoke. Moran tried to inquire about mass times, sacraments, baptisms. There were no responses, only the measured thump of a pendulum clock somewhere down the hall, the kind used to time prayers or birthing contractions. He left the table with unease pricking the back of his neck. 2 days later, the town physician, Dr. Charles Hemmings, was summoned to the edge of the monastery grounds after a passing rancher found a bundle swaddled in pale linen behind the north wall. The bundle, at first mistaken for a discarded cloth, contained signs of a recent delivery: fresh blood, a torn umbilical cord, and a length of rosary beads knotted tightly at one end. The child was nowhere to be found. Dr. Hemmings filed a confidential report to the Territorial Health Board in Albuquerque. That report, uncovered decades later in the estate of his grandson, described the linens as not consistent with any hospital issue, noting the embroidery at the corners, 7-petaled stars stitched in red thread, too deliberate to be decorative. The first whisperings in town came from Martina Lujan, a laundress who tended to garments from both the mission and surrounding ranches. She reported in a July 1887 deposition that she was paid to wash a bundle of blood-soaked cloths without being told the source. What disturbed her most was that the cloths, once cleaned and returned, reappeared again within a fortnight in the same condition. Same weight, same smell, same stains, she wrote. Not like from injury, like from birth. At the edge of the arroyo, near the monastery's eastern wall, neighbors began noticing shallow mounds, 7 in all, shaped like graves but unmarked, lacking any crosses or headstones. On the evening of August 17, 1887, an itinerant sheep herder named Elias Naranjo claimed to see a figure kneeling near one of the mounds, humming lowly. When he returned the next morning, the soil had been disturbed and faint prints of bare feet led back to the monastery gate. Sheriff Elijah Combs made a formal visit shortly after. His journal, now housed in the Socorro County Archives, details his attempt to enter the monastery's lower levels. "Cellar door is sealed by nail and wax," he noted. "Smell of vinegar and herbs through cracks in wood. Refused entry by none would not state name. Bell did not ring during visit." He returned with a court order a week later, but the cellar had been cleared, the wax melted away, and only crates of spoiled roots and brittle sacramental wine remained. The escalation did not end there. A missing persons report dated October 1887 describes the disappearance of a parturient woman, one Lorenza Tapia, aged 24, last seen entering the monastery 3 days before her expected delivery. She was unmarried, and her cousin testified that she had been encouraged by a sister Lucia to seek a discreet holy birth. No hospital, church, or family ever received news of her again. Her name is recorded in a baptismal margin, then crossed out with a thick ink stroke. The town schoolmaster, Edwin Bell, later submitted a formal letter to the Department of Education requesting exemption from Sunday services at Santa Perdita for his pupils, citing disturbing utterances from the children after chapel visits. Several students, aged between 6 and 9, described a hidden baby that never cries out loud, and a room under the floor with blankets and bells. Bell's petition was denied. In November, Father Moran returned with another priest, Father Ramon Quevedo, and an archivist from Santa Fe named Henry Lowell. The 3 men conducted a full review of the monastery's records. What they discovered was stark. 7 birth entries recorded between 1882 and 1887, each labeled Filius Ignotus or Filia Ignota, unknown son, unknown daughter. No surnames, no parental records, no corresponding baptisms. Yet all entries were followed by the same Latin phrase, ex ordine et silentio, by order and silence. Lowell, a fastidious man with wire spectacles and a known interest in anomalous ecclesiastical texts, noted something else, the marginalia in each. Ledger was written in a distinct ink, different from the main entries, and contained initials that did not match any known sister or visiting priest. Initials appear only once, then vanish, no repetition, always preceded by drawn symbol, crescent and star. The inquiry was halted when Bishop Salpointe withdrew his authorization without explanation. Rumors spread that a benefactor from New York had financed the monastery's last renovation and had requested discretion regarding certain special retreats. No name was ever confirmed, but a shipping ledger from 1886 recorded the delivery of 7 crates of surgical instruments, herbal compounds, and infant linens to S.P. Monastery Socorro, originating from a supplier in Manhattan. By year's end, a faint tension settled over Socorro. The chapel no longer held open mass. The bell, once rung every Sunday at dawn, remained silent. Those who passed the monastery at night reported flickering lamplight in the sealed cellar window and once a shriek that ended as if smothered by cloth. When Sister Esperanza was finally approached again by Father Moran, she simply placed her hand to his chest and whispered the only word anyone ever heard her speak: "No." Você disse. Now continue with Chapter 1, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, beginning of the escalation. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly, Chapter 1, Part 2 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista Ingles Longa Horror dice, by December 1887, Socorro's town council began informally debating the status of the Santa Perdida monastery, prompted not by religious authority, but by complaints from local families regarding processions at unlit hours and whispers beyond the fence. The monastery, which once held modest community ties, was now encircled by apprehension. The adobe perimeter wall, topped with shards of glass embedded in mortar, had been recently reinforced. Townspeople claimed to hear soft weeping behind it at dusk. The postmaster, John M. Kendall, noticed an unusual volume of outbound correspondence in early winter. Though the sisters had long avoided contact with outside entities, he recorded 15 sealed letters bearing the monastery's wax emblem, an angel with eyes closed, sent eastward between January and February. All were addressed in identical handwriting to New York and Philadelphia. The recipients, all women, remained unidentified. Kendall, struck by the flurry of postal activity and the sudden silence that followed, noted that after February 12th, the monastery ceased sending mail altogether. In a sworn statement later filed in Santa Fe, Kendall described the sender as a woman in her early 20s, not previously seen in town, dressed in secular clothing and wearing a mourning veil. She refused to speak, instead presenting the letters with gloved hands. The detail that disturbed him most, he confessed, was that her breath fogged the glass even in the dry winter heat, and that she returned to the same spot outside the post office each day for nearly a week, watching without entering again. That same month, the body of Lorenza Tapia's cousin, Tomas Gallegos, was pulled from a dry well 2 miles east of the monastery. A known drinker and mule handler, Tomas had allegedly visited Santa Perdida to demand information about his missing relative. His death was initially ruled accidental, but a medical note in Dr. Hemming's files observed trauma inconsistent with a fall. His fingers were broken, as if he had clawed at the interior stone. No charges were filed. Suspicion intensified when municipal clerk Adelaide Rawlins, tasked with updating the birth records for Socorro County, found 7 corresponding blank entries between 1882 and 1887, each time-stamped but unnamed. The pages were intact, yet the fields where names, parentage, and residence should have been written were left completely clean, as if bypassed in the process. All 7 pages contained a faint watermark, visible only at a slant, the seal of the Sisters of Perpetual Intercession. Rawlins brought the pages to the attention of Deputy Clerk Rufino Chavez, who inspected them under lamplight. He later testified that the margins bore faint indentations, ghostwriting left by an uninked pen. A rubbing technique revealed partial inscriptions, Latin terms, recurring initials, and the word custodita, meaning guarded. One date, November 9, 1884, appeared twice. That same day had been marked by the sudden illness and death of a pregnant woman traveling north from Mesilla. Her husband's name, Martin Escobar, appeared in the marriage registry of the Santa Fe mission, but his child was never found. Outside the monastery's eastern orchard, near the dried-up irrigation ditch, carpenter Hector Molina was contracted to repair a section of collapsed fencing. In his work notes, he reported finding a rotting wooden box buried shallowly beneath the orchard's largest fig tree. Inside was a bundle of pale cloth, several infant-sized copper bracelets, and a decayed manuscript wrapped in wax paper. Molina, unsure of its significance, delivered it to the sheriff's office. The manuscript, later reviewed by linguist Dr. Adeline Morgan at the University of New Mexico, was written in a cipher combining Castilian Spanish, ecclesiastical Latin, and Nahuatl. Portions were translated into fragmented phrases: 7 vessels prepared, silence binds the mother, and names forbidden for the sake of return. The meaning was unclear, but the document dated itself to 1883, the same year the monastery underwent internal reconstruction funded by unnamed Eastern donors. From the winter of 1887 into the spring of 1888, reports continued. A nurse from Magdalena named Clara Hollings wrote in her personal diary of a patient admitted to her care. A woman suffering from severe postnatal hemorrhage, delirious, and repeating the same phrase, "Not mine, not mine, not mine." The woman had no records in the local hospitals. Her wound dressings matched the rough linen used by the monastery. By March, Father Moran, whose journal had grown increasingly cryptic, recorded his final visit. He described the chapel interior as darker than before, though no windows had been altered. The crucifix above the altar had been shrouded in violet cloth out of liturgical season. He noted an odor of iron and damp earth emanating from the choir stalls, and a pile of freshly used blankets folded on the floor beside the statue of Saint Anne, traditionally associated with childbearing. On that same visit, Moran claimed to have heard voices in the lower cloister, not in prayer, but in argument, soft, urgent words in a language he could not identify. When he turned the corner, there was only Sister Esperanza seated on the floor beside a basin of water, her hands stained dark red up to the wrists. She looked up at him, smiled faintly, and said nothing. His last journal entry, dated April 2, 1888, was brief. It is no longer sacred ground. Shortly after, Father Moran left New Mexico. The diocese removed him from the registry of active priests the following year without public explanation. Santa Perdida remained operational into the early 1890s, though it was never again inspected by church officials. The final territorial census listing the monastery in 1892 recorded 4 residents: Esperanza, Lucia, and 2 unnamed postulants. After that, the monastery disappears from formal records, but not from memory. In 1893, 2 U.S. Marshals investigating missing persons cases in the Southwest found their way to Socorro. In an unsealed report, they mentioned hearing accounts from nearby ranchers of a ghost nun appearing at night with a lantern, moving toward the arroyo and returning empty-handed. Though the word ghost was used, the report emphasized the repeated nature of the sightings. Same time, same route, same figure, over multiple weeks. They visited Santa Perdida. What they found was silence. The building stood intact, its doors barred from the inside. Through a narrow opening in the southern wall, one marshal glimpsed a figure moving slowly past the inner cloister, holding what looked like a tightly wrapped bundle. No cries, no words. Just the muffled creak of floorboards and a breeze heavy with the scent of iron and sage. They did not force entry. Vosedis now continue with Chapter 2, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script escalation, where you will show how events become more disturbing and impossible to ignore. Introduce external figures, investigators, journalists, authorities, religious figures, and their first impressions. Add contradictions, disappearance of evidence and conflicting accounts. Increase the tension with every sentence, preparing the viewer for the climax. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 2, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingles longa hora dice. In the summer of 1888, the monastery of Santa Perdita came under formal investigation, not by the church, but by an entirely secular force, the Territorial Bureau of Health. After the fifth reported instance of unregistered birth complications in Socorro County, all involving women with no prior prenatal care records, the Bureau dispatched Dr. Aldous Fenn, a medical inspector known for his rigid empiricism and complete indifference to religious institutions. He arrived in Socorro with a single assistant, a young ethnographer named Julian Ward, assigned to document community medical practices among isolated populations. Dr. Fenn was unimpressed by the town's reverence for the sisters. In his initial report to the Bureau, he noted that Santa Perdita is anachronistic in both function and sanitation. The nuns are either untrained or deliberately evasive. Their surroundings show neglect, yet their records, those few we've seen, are obsessively maintained in Latin, with no clarity on the identity of those born or treated within. He was granted temporary lodging in a two-room building previously used by missionaries. From there, he made 3 visits to the monastery. On the second, he requested to examine the cellar directly. Sister Lucia received him in the main hall, where an oil lamp flickered low, casting moving shadows across the wall frescoes. She answered him only by turning toward a door behind the chapel and unlocking it with a key worn nearly flat. The smell struck him immediately. Damp soil, iodine, and something metallic. He descended with Ward. At the bottom, they found a corridor carved into the bedrock, lined with shelves holding apothecary bottles, some labeled in Latin, others marked only by symbols, stars, moons, slashes. At the far end was a room with 2 narrow cots and a wash basin. No birthing equipment, no linens, no sign of recent use. Fenn, unsatisfied, asked to see their infirmary logbooks. The next morning, the sisters provided 3 volumes of notes, each meticulously copied and bound in red leather, but the pages they contained were wrong. Julian Ward, cross-referencing with the regional census, observed that every patient listed under the years 1882 to 1887 bore the names of women known to be deceased, some as early as 1879. He noted this anomaly in his journal, writing, "Entries are chronologically correct but biographically impossible. Records appear genuine, no sign of tampering, yet these women were already dead." When Fenn returned to confront the sisters, they presented him with a new set of books. These volumes bore no resemblance to the previous logs. Now the records were sparse in English and listed only 3 births across a 10-year period. The previous books had vanished. Frustrated, he sent Ward to investigate the neighboring homesteads for testimony. Ward interviewed 6 families. 5 admitted that someone in their household, distant cousin, servant, niece, had received some form of care from the sisters, though never through formal channels. One woman, Ana Morales, spoke of a visitor in 1886, a girl of perhaps 16, who arrived heavy with child and vanished within the month. "They said she'd gone to relatives in Albuquerque," Morales said, "but she left her boots by the door and her mother kept crying into the stove." The 6th family, the Villarreals, denied all connection to the monastery. Yet Ward observed, their barn contained a cot, a chipped basin, and a stack of faded linen with the same 7-pointed star embroidered in red. When asked about it, the patriarch claimed it was from an old wedding trousseau and declined to elaborate. Back in Socorro, news of the investigation reached the hands of a small but active publication, the Territorial Courier. Reporter Lydia Crane, known for her blunt prose and disregard for political patronage, traveled from Albuquerque to conduct her own inquiry. She arrived in early September 1888, just as the desert heat began to break and the air thickened with the scent of juniper smoke. Crane's article never ran. Her editor, Charles Wilkes, later testified that she returned from Socorro with pages of notes, sketches of the monastery grounds, and a half-filled notebook of interviews. 2 days later, she was called to Santa Fe for a deposition related to an unrelated land dispute. She never arrived. Her hotel room was found untouched, her belongings intact, and her notes gone. A single telegram sent from a station in Los Lunas arrived at the courier office 3 days later. It read only, "They know. Leave it." The handwriting did not match hers. Months later, a page from her original notes surfaced in a private collection donated to the University of Arizona. The page contained a hand-drawn map of the Santa Perdita grounds with the word vault circled 3 times near the northwest corner. Beneath it, in Crane's unmistakable hand, "Why bury nothing yet mark it so well?" The mounting contradictions drew the attention of a third-party observer. Bishop Salpointe's successor, Father Agustin Herrero, who had long suspected that something had been concealed from the diocese. Unlike his predecessor, Herrero was politically cautious and relied heavily on legal pretext. He arranged for a team of church-appointed surveyors to visit Santa Perdita under the guise of assessing land use. Their goal was simple: identify any undocumented structures or subterranean chambers. The surveyors, Manuel Recio, Wallace Craig, and a hired local named Levi Holcomb, arrived with measuring tools, official seals, and a map dating back to the original 1819 construction. What they found was a structural inconsistency between the east and west wings. A space measuring approximately 15 by 30 feet existed in the blueprints, but not in reality. When asked, the sisters claimed the area had collapsed decades ago and was sealed for safety. Holcomb, skeptical, noted that the external wall was intact and bore no signs of damage. That night, he returned alone. Holcomb's widow later testified that he came home near dawn, covered in dust and visibly shaken. He refused to speak for several hours. When he did, he claimed to have heard crying, low, rhythmic, not of pain, but of effort. "Like someone working underground," he said. He died 8 months later of typhoid, but not before leaving behind a half-page sketch in his tool chest, a stone archway beneath the soil, and beneath it, rows of markings he labeled birthing dates. Following Holcomb's death, Father Herrero quietly shelved the investigation. The church closed the matter officially in January 1889, citing insufficient evidence of malfeasance. The Santa Perdita Monastery remained under internal jurisdiction, with no further interference permitted. Yet reports continued. 2 nuns from another convent in Las Vegas, New Mexico, wrote anonymously to the courier, describing whispered accounts from postulants who had been sent briefly to Socorro for training. One letter read, "They do not pray at night, they listen, as if waiting for something to call back." Another, "There are no infants, and yet the cradle rocks." In a final attempt to clarify matters, Julian Ward returned in early 1889, now working independently. He posed as a census enumerator to gain access. Once inside, he documented something no one had yet recorded: an interior wall freshly painted in the main cloister corridor. The paint was thick and uneven, and when he leaned close, he detected the faint outline of what had once been a door. He knocked. From within, a sound answered him, not a voice, not movement. A bell. "Você diz, now continue with Chapter 2, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script Escalation. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 2, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 rotirista, ingles longa hora dice. Julian Ward left the monastery that evening, with the sound still echoing faintly in his memory. A bell tolling once, flat and lifeless, from behind a wall, that by all architectural standards should not have existed. He walked the perimeter twice before departing, his field journal clutched beneath his coat, and returned to his boarding room without speaking to anyone. That night he recorded only a single line. Wall added recently. Paint still tacky near baseboard, no ventilation. The next morning, before sunrise, the door to his room was found ajar. His journal, open on the desk, contained torn pages. A few remained. On one, a sketch of the cloister corridor with arrows pointing toward the hidden door. On another, an unfinished sentence. If they are not burying them, then, followed by an inky smear trailing off the page. Ward left Socorro by train later that day, heading east. He was never seen there again. In April 1889, 3 months after the official closure of all diocesan inquiries, a private legal advocate from Santa Fe, Jeremiah Holt, arrived in Socorro, claiming to represent the estate of an unwed mother named Pilar Anaya. Her family, modest but influential in the Rio Abajo region, had not heard from her since she was sent to the monastery for rest and discretion during her pregnancy in mid-1886. Holt carried affidavits, a request for medical documentation, and a signed letter from Pilar's sister, who had been told the child had been adopted by a parish in Kansas. The parish denied any knowledge of the child. Holt sought entry to the monastery to demand the release of Pilar's delivery records. Sister Lucia met him at the outer gate, but refused all entry. She handed him a folded parchment sealed in wax. Holt opened it and found only a single line written in Latin. Non revocantur quae donata sunt. What has been given cannot be taken back. Holt, an educated man with legal training, recognized the phrase as a contract term. He left visibly disturbed. He spent the next several weeks combing county records, private correspondences, and burial registries. His notes, preserved in his law firm's archive, document his findings. Between 1882 and 1892, 7 young women from the Rio Abajo region disappeared during or shortly after pregnancy, all previously sent to Socorro for care. None had burial records, emigration papers, or any confirmed sightings after entering Santa Perdida. More troubling, the names of these women did not appear in any public birth or death registries. They did appear, however, faintly in one location. A personal inventory led by an unnamed scribe, discovered decades later in the sealed box once, belonging to Dr. Hemmings. The inventory listed entries with no surnames, just given names, followed by dates and brief annotations. One read, Isabel, 14 hours, returned to silence. Another, Renata, breach, survived, removed, 7th night. In June of that year, a traveling Jesuit, Father Luis Marchetti, visited Socorro while en route to El Paso. He stayed only 2 nights but reported his experience in a letter to the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, where he occasionally lectured. The letter, filed in the university's Religious Anomalies archive, described Santa Perdida as less a house of God than a vault of a mission. He noted the absence of bells for prayer, the replacement of holy water fonts with dry basins, and a strange ritual observed through a side window during evening prayers. 7 sisters seated in silence, eyes closed, each holding a white cloth in their laps, slowly folding and unfolding it in synchrony. No crucifix adorned the wall, no scripture was read aloud. At the end, a small bell was rung, and the women stood and dispersed without a word. Marchetti attempted to inquire, but was escorted from the premises by a woman he identified only as the Silent One. He wrote that her expression was not hostile, but unreachably resigned, as if protecting something ancient and already doomed. His final note read, "They are not hiding the children. They are hiding what they are doing to the memory of them." Despite mounting documentation, each new revelation led to further contradiction. When Holt returned with a county official to issue a demand for the monastery's patient records, they found the building shuttered, its gates barred from the inside. Smoke rose faintly from a chimney, but no one answered the bell. After an hour, Holt noticed that the iron plate on the outer gate, the one bearing the monastery's name, had been removed. Only the nail holes remained. The official posted the notice on the wooden door and left it there. The following morning it had been torn down. Later that week, Holt met with the regional magistrate to request an order of forced entry, but the request was denied. The magistrate claimed that, due to lack of evidence of active wrongdoing, and in respect to religious autonomy, no further intrusion would be permitted. Unless there is a living plaintiff, he said, there is no crime to pursue. By the end of summer 1889, local clergy stopped referring to the Sisters of Perpetual Intercession by name. In sermons and meetings they were now simply the Women at Santa Perdida. Baptism records were redirected to the parish in Lemitar. Deliveries were encouraged at home or in secular facilities. The monastery's place in the community vanished, not by force, but by omission. In the autumn of that same year, a letter arrived at the residence of Bishop Herrero, unsigned, written in elegant script. It contained no return address and bore no seal. The letter read, 7-1 each year, taken before memory roots, no graves, no cries, only the order. Attached was a small square of white linen, embroidered with the same red 7-petaled star. Bishop Herrero retired the following year. He never issued another public statement. The final known contact with the monastery came in the form of an article draft submitted anonymously to a short-lived literary periodical, The Western Review, published out of Taos. The article, never printed but preserved among the editor's rejected submissions, bore the title, The Bells That Were Never Blessed. It read, in part, I walked the orchard by moonlight, the fig trees whispered as if in breath, and from beneath the soil not 6 feet down came the scent of milk and ink. They are there. Not alive, not gone, just unwitnessed. By early 1890, no one entered Santa Perdida. The sisters remained within. No new postulants arrived. The town stopped speaking of it entirely. But every spring, without fail, the grass in the east orchard grew higher than anywhere else, and under the apricot tree nearest the north wall, the ground remained soft, as if recently turned. Você disse, now continue with Chapter 3, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script confrontation or discovery, report the most intense and revealing moment, discovery of bodies, files, forbidden objects, hidden rooms, etc. Describe every visual and auditory detail realistically, avoiding gratuitous gore but not concealing the gravity. Show the reactions of witnesses and authorities in the face of the revealed horror. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary. Summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 roterista Inglis longa horror dice. It was a freak hailstorm in the spring of 1890 that cracked open the first wall. A thunderclap struck the northwest corner of Santa Perdida during a sudden April squall, sending a sheet of limestone crumbling from the outer cloister. The collapse revealed what should have been solid foundation, but behind the fractured stone there was only a narrow void, dark and dry, and the remnants of what had once been a sealed archway. 3 days later, a construction crew from the county, dispatched under the pretext of storm damage assessment, arrived to evaluate the structure. The foreman, Calvin Wright, had been instructed not to force entry, only to document damage. But what he and his men found behind the rubble drew them beyond caution. Inside the exposed passage was a corridor, cramped, stone-lined, silent. The air held the dry, stale chill of underground places. A single rusted sconce remained affixed to the wall unlit. No light reached the end. They advanced slow, their boots scuffing across a floor layered with powdery dust and old pine needles, as if the passage had once been used and then forgotten. After 17 paces, the space widened into a chamber. What they discovered was not a crypt nor a cell. It was a room of objects. Wooden cradles, stacked in threes, lined the left wall. Each bore a date carved roughly into the headboard. All from years between 1882 and 1887. None had any bedding, only faint darkened stains where fabric had once lain. In the center of the room sat a low birthing chair, carved from dark wood, worn at the edges, its seat upholstered with cracked leather. On the floor beneath it was a rust-colored ring soaked deep into the stone. Beside it, a small copper bell with no clapper. The men said nothing for several minutes. Against the far wall, 3 wooden chests had been pushed tightly together. One had warped from moisture. Inside the first were dozens of cloths, folded meticulously and stained beyond laundering. The second chest held correspondence, letters written in Spanish and French, most addressed to no one, many unsigned. They referenced deliveries under silence, tokens returned to sender, and phrases like offered before breath and kept below, the sight of heaven. The final chest was sealed shut with wire. The men forced it open with a crowbar. Inside were books, not religious tomes or parish records, but hand-bound volumes, each marked with a number and tied shut with linen ribbon. When the ribbon of the first volume was undone, its contents revealed a catalogue. Each entry bore a date, a weight, a gender, and a short notation in Latin. Silentia, non videtur, recessit. One name appeared more than once. Maria R. The smell inside the room shifted then, musty parchment overtaken by something sharp, acrid, mineral. One of the workers, Charles Rowan, doubled over and vomited near the archway. Another, Nate Purdy, turned and left without explanation, later refusing to speak of what he saw. Calvin Wright returned with the local sheriff the following day. Sheriff Combs, now in his final year of service, entered with 2 deputies and a local scribe to make a formal inventory. His notes, filed with the county under sealed appendix until 1927, described the interior as a preserved scene of methodical procedure, not abandonment. The cradles, he wrote, were too small for living children, more like ritual containers, unused in the ordinary sense. On the eastern wall, behind a hanging cloth embroidered with the 7-pointed star, they found a hidden cabinet. Inside were 7 glass jars, each containing a lock of dark hair suspended in alcohol. Paper tags beneath each jar bore initials and dates, corresponding precisely to the missing birth records from the county clerk's office. At the sight of this, Deputy Allard reportedly said only, "God forgive them," and walked out. Word spread faster than the sheriff's team could control it. By the end of the week, a handful of locals, including former nurse Clara Hollings and postmaster John Kendall, had arrived to see the chamber. Hollings identified one of the jars by its date. "That's the girl who bled out in my parlor," she whispered. "They said she'd been buried by her family, but her kin was never told." Confrontation with the monastery was now unavoidable. Sheriff Combs delivered a formal summons to the sisters, citing unauthorized medical practice, concealment of human remains, and refusal to cooperate with territorial mandates. He left the notice nailed to the monastery gate. It remained untouched for 3 days. On the 4th day, the gates were open. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The courtyard was swept, the altar cleared of its shroud, and all 4 sisters stood waiting in silence. Their faces were impassive, but their hands were uncovered for the first time. Each bore a faded scar across the palm. When asked if they understood the summons, Sister Esperanza nodded. She then turned and led the officers down a hallway not listed on any blueprint. At its end, they found another sealed door. This one opened to a narrow stairwell, descending into the earth with no handrail and no light. Sister Esperanza handed Combs a taper candle. "This is the last," she said. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were lined with chalk markings, stars, circles, symbols resembling part of the Latin alphabet. At the bottom was a chamber unlike the first. This one was lined with niches. Each held a bundle wrapped in white linen, tied with twine, 17 in total, some small enough to hold in one hand, others larger, none labeled, none warm. Sister Lucia, who had not spoken in more than 5 years, finally did. They were not abandoned, she said. They were requested. The word sent a silence through the group more piercing than any scream. A final discovery came when one of the deputies, examining the stone floor, noticed a shallow recess beneath a rug. Lifting it revealed a trapdoor, warped and damp. When pried open, it exhaled a sour gust of air, metallic, earthy, dense. Inside was a pit, barely wide enough for a man to pass through, leading to a tunnel carved into the limestone bed. At its end, a small wooden cart lay overturned, beside a heap of burned documents. A scorched iron brand, 7-pointed used for cattle, lay cooling in the ash. Nothing else, no remains, no answers. The site was sealed the following day. The monastery was placed under provincial custody. The sisters were taken separately to the holding cells in Socorro, each refusing to speak except Sister Esperanza, who asked only for her breviary. In the ledger filed that evening by Sheriff Combs, under description of items recovered, he wrote 17 linen bundles, 7 cradles, 1 chair, books without God, no cries. Vocidis, now continue with Chapter 3, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Confrontation or Discovery. This part must contain between 1,100 and 500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, do not lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 3, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista. Ingles longa horror dice. The holding cells in Socorro's courthouse were small, windowless, and never intended to house religious personnel. Yet in May of 1890, they became the temporary residence of the last 4 sisters of Santa Perdida. No charges had been formally filed, none yet fit the known statutes, but public pressure, mounting since the discovery of the subterranean vault, forced the territorial court to act. Sister Esperanza was kept separate from the others. She neither resisted nor spoke further after requesting her breviary. Her silence unnerved the guards. Each morning they found her seated upright on the cot, hands folded, eyes open and unfocused. She did not eat. She accepted only water. In the neighboring cell, Sister Lucia murmured the hours in Latin, matins, lauds, vespers, but refused to answer any questions. Her voice, hoarse and breathless, faltered after the first day. By the third, she had gone silent again. The younger postulants, Sisters Clara and Inez, barely moved at all. One wept without sound, her nails dug into the mattress. The courthouse clerk, Elias Reed, tasked with documenting their condition, recorded in his logbook, no signs of duress, no requests, no plea of innocence, as if they anticipated this, or worse, accepted it. Public officials debated the course of action. Bishop Herrero, contacted again, refused involvement. The diocese in Santa Fe issued a single line. The Sisters of Perpetual Intercession operated outside ecclesiastical jurisdiction as of 1885. A sudden date, retroactively assigned. No documentation supported it. No orders to dissolve had been issued, yet no one could prove otherwise. The monastery had existed in a bureaucratic shadow. Under mounting scrutiny, the sheriff's office ordered a second excavation of the monastery's lower chambers. Overseen by Dr. Aldous Fenn, returning now not as investigator but as reluctant witness, the process unearthed further anomalies. The stone room beneath the birthing chamber, the one previously sealed by a warped trapdoor, was found to contain narrow trenches carved into the floor like shallow troughs, each lined with scorched linen and crushed herbs. Fenn identified traces of valerian, rue and blue cohosh, all used historically in childbirth and in the prevention of it. charred fragments of parchment were recovered near the back wall. Though largely destroyed, a few lines survived. Not named, so not bound. Silence as preservation, not penance. Return only when time has no witness. At the end of the chamber, behind a makeshift partition of boards, a final bundle was found, larger than the rest, wrapped in black cloth, sealed with red wax. It was not opened at the site. The object was transferred under guard to the courthouse, where it remained sealed in a lockbox. When presented with the bundle during questioning, Sister Esperanza finally reacted. She stood. The guards, unused to movement from any of the sisters, froze as she stepped forward, placed her hand against the box, and said in perfect English, "It will undo what silence preserved." Then she sat and did not speak again. The next morning, the box was opened in the presence of the territorial judge, Sheriff Combs, and Dr. Fenn. Inside was a thick manuscript, hand-bound, its cover unmarked. The contents were not written in Latin, but a combination of phonetic symbols, Spanish notations, and codes. Fenn, studying it over several nights, identified its pattern. A rotational cipher aligned with feast days, liturgical calendars, and astronomical events. With patience, he decrypted enough to understand the manuscript's function, a record of offerings, not of infants, but of silence. A ledger of those who had agreed, voluntarily or otherwise, to relinquish the right to speak of what they had carried. Each entry included a date, a diagram of a birth position, a notation of the child's fate, and a sigil, 7 rays surrounding a dark center. In the margins, annotations noted payments not in coin, but in custody transfer, infants handed off, then erased. Several names matched those of women presumed dead or missing. Others bore only initials. But one page marked 1884 was different. It described a woman named Pilar Anaya. Beneath her name was a sketch. A woman seated in profile, head turned away, arms empty. The final line read, "An infant without bond. Return to the order. No cry. No sin." Fenn closed the manuscript and refused to continue. He passed the task to Elias Reed, who copied segments by hand for official records, but only fragments were retained. The full manuscript disappeared 2 days later. The lockbox had been emptied. The keys accounted for, no forced entry. When the sheriff confronted the courthouse staff, no one admitted responsibility. Yet that same evening, Sister Esperanza was found dead in her cell. She had removed the binding from her breviary and used it to tighten a loop around her throat. No note, no indication. Her face bore no sign of struggle. Her hands, still scarred, were folded across her chest, one clutching the frayed linen square that had once sealed the manuscript. Her death triggered a chain of silence. Sister Lucia was transferred to a sanatorium in Albuquerque. She never spoke again. The younger sisters were returned to families whose names were not recorded in any formal ledger. The monastery was officially condemned and boarded shut. Within months, the territorial government ceased further inquiry. The official cause: lack of legal foundation, no viable witnesses, no surviving victims, no formal charges, but a series of letters, anonymous and unsigned, began arriving at medical offices across the state. Each contained a single date, a name and a weight in pounds. Each was postmarked from New York. None were traced. Among them was a letter sent to Dr. Fenn. It contained only a single line. "You measured them, but not what was taken." With the sisters scattered and the monastery sealed, the remaining artifacts were divided. Some were transferred to the regional archives. Others were quietly destroyed. But the birthing chair, its frame marked with deep, symmetrical notches, was never claimed. It remained in the sheriff's evidence storage for decades, wrapped in canvas and forgotten, until the building was renovated in 1934, when it was found again. Still intact, still stained, and beneath the leather seat, tucked into the seam, was a single folded slip of paper. 7 names, all female, no surnames, and beside each, a place. To be sent, New York. Você disse, now continue with Chapter 4, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script consequences and legacy. Report the outcome: arrests, closures, trials, political or social changes. Show how the community and collective memory dealt with the case in the following years. Conclude with an enigmatic and unsettling final sentence that leaves a lingering doubt in the viewer's mind. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 4, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingles longa horror dice. By the close of 1890, the official response to the events at Santa Perdida had grown cold and fragmented. No indictments were filed. No proceedings were opened in any territorial or federal court. The findings, books, bundles, jars, ciphers, were either labeled inadmissible or quietly reassigned to private collections. The Attorney General of the New Mexico Territory issued a statement in December of that year, referring to the case only as an incident of ecclesiastical irregularity, followed by a formal recommendation for non-intervention in sealed convent matters. What remained of the monastery's property was parceled off in 3 tranches, one to the Diocese of Santa Fe, one to a private agricultural cooperative based in Lemitar, and one, oddly and without explanation, to a charity trust, incorporated in New York City under the name St. Agatha's Redeemers. The last entity never claimed the land, never developed it, and ceased correspondence within 2 years. The trust was dissolved in 1897 without ever listing a board of directors. Santa Perdida was shuttered, then left to rot. For a time, the building remained intact. By 1893, its roof had begun to collapse, and its eastern wing, once the orchard storehouse, was overtaken by mesquite. Livestock wandered through the old cloister gates. Locals avoided the property, not out of superstition, but because of the unease it stirred. Even children, usually drawn to abandoned places, refused to cross the perimeter wall. The land was dry, choked with dust and chaparral, but still every spring the fig trees produced fruit. In the town of Socorro, those who had once worked with or around the monastery adjusted their narratives. Postmaster Kendall retired without giving a formal statement. Elias Reed, the courthouse clerk who had transcribed segments of the manuscript, burned his copies and left New Mexico for Colorado. Sheriff Combs gave a deposition to the territorial governor, but requested it be sealed until such time that it does not burden the living. It remained unread until after his death in 1904. In it he wrote, "We found no remains in the way the law expects, but there was loss, measurable loss, and a silence that cost more than sound. Of the sisters, only Sister Inez resurfaced in the public record. In 1895, she was listed as a domestic servant in the home of a wealthy family in Kansas City. She died of consumption 3 years later. No obituary mentioned her time in New Mexico. Sister Lucia remained in care until her death in 1901. Her attending physician noted she died with her mouth open, gasping as if trying to say something. Her last word was not recorded. The monastery itself was finally demolished in 1902 by order of the town council. The stone was sold for building materials, the wood carted away for fuel. During demolition, workers uncovered a final compartment beneath the chancel floor, an iron box, rusted shut, bolted into the foundation. It took 2 hours to remove. Inside was a stack of written contracts, all signed with inked thumbprints, all pledging custodial discretion in perpetuity, each naming a woman of childbearing age and waiving all rights to birth records, burial, or correspondence. None bore official letterhead. Each was dated. All between 1882 and 1887, no authorities responded to the discovery. The documents were never added to a court record. They were passed instead to a legal historian in Albuquerque, who filed them under the heading Unenforceable Ecclesiastical Covenants. They were later lost in a fire. In the decades that followed, Socorro changed. The railroads expanded. The courthouse was rebuilt. New churches took root, unconnected to Santa Perdida's history. The story receded into rumor, and then into partial memory. When asked, older residents might refer vaguely to the nuns who didn't talk or that old place with no mass. Only a few recalled the precise details. Fewer still were willing to speak of them. Yet the land never fully forgot. In 1916, an attempt was made to plant cotton across the old monastery grounds. Workers reported equipment malfunctions, soil discoloration, and a strange, sour smell from the southern edge of the field. Crops failed within 2 years. By 1920, the land was abandoned again. In 1928, during the construction of a new water line near the northern boundary of the original orchard, laborers unearthed a series of stones arranged in a perfect 7-pointed star, set into the earth with lime mortar. Each point had been aligned with a corresponding seasonal solstice. Beneath the central stone was a hollow cavity, empty but for a single bronze tag, tarnished and corroded. The letters had almost faded. What remained were the words custodita non revocata. The object was discarded. No photographs were taken. Years later, in a 1941 interview with the Works Progress Administration, a surviving rancher who had grown up near Santa Perdida offered a memory unprompted. "I remember the orchard," he said. "Wasn't much left by then, but my mother used to keep us from the figs. Said they weren't for us, said they tasted of iron, and that they never made a sound when they fell." Você disse. Now continue with Chapter 4, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Consequences and Legacy. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. Attention. This is the final part of the script. This structure is mandatory. No exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, obscene lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of Chapter 4, Part 2, include this text exactly as written. Text. Write only and exactly. Chapter 4, Part 2 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. Roterista Ingles Longa Horror dice. In the winter of 1947, decades after Santa Perdida had crumbled into earth and rumor, a series of land surveys were commissioned to rechart rural parcels along the Rio Grande corridor for federal redistribution. Among the assigned territories was the stretch once occupied by the monastery, now listed only as Plot 118B, Decommissioned Religious Facility, Non-Operational. A young cartographer, Harold Epstein, arrived with a measuring crew and a copy of the 1881 plat map. What he encountered did not match any known layout. The ground resisted measurement. Angles refused to square. Compass bearings drifted. One surveyor remarked that the soil felt loose beneath the crust like digging into peat. Another refused to return after uncovering what he thought was an old cistern, filled not with water, but ash. Their instruments recorded no depth. The opening was recovered without notation. Epstein filed an addendum describing anomalous subsoil formation and unrecorded substructures. The report was marked incomplete and shelved without follow-up. By the early 1950s, memory of the site had faded almost entirely from public record. One final reference emerged in 1953 in the form of a classified ad placed in a New York medical journal. Seeking records or testimony regarding obstetrics, procedures conducted under ecclesiastical auspice, Southwest United States 1880 to 1890. Respondents granted full confidentiality. No name, no contact address, only a P.O. box. The ad ran for 3 weeks before disappearing. What remained instead were fragments, personal accounts that never found their way into the official narrative. A retired nurse in Albuquerque, interviewed in 1962, recalled caring for an old woman with scarring along her abdomen, consistent with multiple deliveries, though she had no known children. She wouldn't speak, the nurse said, but she would trace something on her bedsheet every night before sleep. 7 lines, always 7, fanned out like petals. In 1971, a child playing near an arroyo just east of Socorro uncovered what he thought was a doll's cradle, half buried in the sand. His parents, upon inspection, recognized it as an antique birthing tray. The initials M.R. were carved into the base. No one claimed it. It was donated to a historical society where it remains catalogued under Origin Unknown. The archives of Santa Fe's diocesan registry still bear a gap. 10 full years with no formal mention of Santa. Perdida, not an omission but a deliberate redaction. Between 1882 and 1892, the monastery disappears from baptismal and death records, from property registers, and from internal correspondence. A notation at the top of the missing pages reads simply, "Per special guidance, refrain from transcription." In academic circles, when the topic arises at all, it is couched in uncertainty. The term Santa Perdida births has occasionally appeared in dissertations and unpublished manuscripts, always unofficial, always speculative. One unpublished thesis, found in the basement archives of a Catholic university in Illinois, suggests the site may have participated in a network of silent adoptions, spanning from the New Mexico Territory to East Coast orphanages, operated through informal religious agreements outside canon law. The paper was never submitted. The author withdrew from the university weeks before graduation. The last recorded oral history comes from a woman named Concepcion Arroyo, born in 1886 and interviewed in 1979 at the age of 93. She had lived her entire life in New Mexico, mostly in the village of Lemitar. When asked about Santa Perdida, she responded without hesitation. "My mother was sent there to clean floors, said the walls were too thick. Sound never traveled." She once found a name carved into the underside of a bench in the chapel. A child's name. Dolores. She scrubbed it off with lie. Concepcion was asked if she believed the stories. She said, "It doesn't matter what we believe. It matters that no one ever asked why the fig trees bore no seed. The land remains undeveloped. Attempts to cultivate or sell it have failed for over a century. No dwellings last more than a season. No surveys yield consistent plots. The ground shifts subtly. Foundations crack. Water flows differently there. Some say the silence planted at Santa Perdida was not just ritual, but binding. That the names were not erased, only buried. That there are records still moving, in private hands, in sealed boxes, in city archives marked "Do Not Catalogue," and that sometimes in spring 7 figs still ripen on a single branch. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way, we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.